In 1994, boxing allowed a 45-year-old man to fight for the heavyweight world title. Most fighters don't survive past 30. George Foreman had already lost his belt, his money, and his identity years earlier. He was slower. He was heavier. He was considered a joke. But what most people never ask is this: why would a man who had already lost everything risk being humiliated one last time? This is not a story about luck. It is the story of how a man went from losing everything to rewriting history with one punch. The fight took place on November 5, 1994. Across the ring stood Michael Moorer. 26 years old. Undefeated. Faster. Sharper. Everything a heavyweight champion was supposed to be. The odds were brutal. Foreman was there to lose. Everyone knew it. From the opening bell, the pattern was clear. Moorer circled. Jabbed. Scored clean points. Foreman followed, slow and heavy, absorbing punches that would have ended younger fighters. Round after round, the scorecards drifted further away from him. Commentators spoke as if the ending was inevitable. The crowd waited for the old man to finally fall. But something strange happened as the minutes passed. Foreman didn't panic. He didn't chase. He didn't rush. His face stayed calm, almost detached, as if he had already accepted the worst outcome. Each punch he threw was deliberate, minimal, measured. He wasn't fighting the man in front of him. He was waiting. By the 10th round, the verdict seemed written. Foreman was behind. The belt was slipping away. Then, in a moment so sudden it felt unreal, he stepped forward and threw a single right hand. One punch. No combination. No warning. Moorer collapsed to the canvas. The arena froze. Silence before disbelief. Then chaos. At 45 years old, George Foreman became the oldest heavyweight champion in history. Not by dominance. Not by speed. But by surviving long enough to deliver one moment that erased every doubt. George Foreman was born in 1949, in Marshall, Texas, and raised in Houston. He grew up poor, in a black neighborhood where survival mattered more than dreams. His biological father was absent. The man who raised him struggled to provide. The house was crowded. Money was tight. Discipline was inconsistent. What stayed constant was anger. As a child, Foreman didn't feel small. He felt invisible. School never made sense to him. Authority felt distant. By his early teens, he had dropped out completely. The streets offered something school never did: attention, respect, fear. He became known for fighting, stealing, intimidating. Not because he enjoyed it, but because it worked. Violence gave him a role. Without it, he had none. He later admitted that he expected his life to end early. Prison or death felt inevitable. There was no long-term plan. No future version of himself to protect. Each day was about proving he wasn't weak. Each confrontation was a test. And every test pushed him further into the identity of a problem no one expected to fix. The turning point didn't come from inspiration. It came from intervention. At 16, Foreman joined the Job Corps, a government program designed to pull young men out of trouble. He arrived angry, suspicious, and ready to fight anyone who challenged him. But something unexpected happened there. For the first time, structure didn't feel like control. It felt like direction. It was inside that program that he was introduced to boxing. Not as a dream. As an outlet. A way to release the rage that had been building since childhood. Trainers noticed his size immediately. Then his power. Then the way other boys stopped smiling when he put on gloves. Boxing didn't calm him. It focused him. The ring gave his anger rules. It gave consequences. You couldn't just swing wildly. You had to wait. You had to listen. You had to learn when to stop. For a young man who had never learned restraint, this was new territory. Slowly, discipline replaced chaos. Not completely. But enough. At home, nothing changed. The poverty remained. The environment stayed harsh. But Foreman had found something that made sense. In the ring, effort was rewarded instantly. Strength mattered. Fear could be turned outward instead of inward. Each punch landed confirmed something he had never felt before: purpose. He trained obsessively. Not out of love for the sport, but out of fear of returning to who he was before. Boxing became the barrier between the life he was escaping and the one he didn't yet understand. The harder he trained, the further that old version drifted away. By the time he entered amateur competitions, his reputation followed him. He wasn't technical. He wasn't graceful. He was terrifying. Other fighters saw the anger in his eyes and hesitated. That hesitation became his advantage. Winning didn't feel like joy. It felt like relief. Another day survived. Another proof that he was becoming someone else. But underneath the rise was an unspoken truth. Foreman wasn't learning how to process emotion. He was learning how to weaponize it. The rage that fueled him never disappeared. It was simply redirected. And while that made him dangerous in the ring, it also planted the seeds of the struggles that would come later. Because when your entire identity is built on strength, there is no plan for what happens when strength fails. And no one was teaching him that yet. Fan 4, First Steps into Career. By the late 1960s, George Foreman's life had narrowed into a single direction. Boxing was no longer just an outlet. It was the only structure holding everything else together. Training gave his days shape. Winning gave him validation. Losing, which rarely happened at that stage, felt unthinkable. He progressed through amateur boxing at a speed that surprised even his coaches. His technique was raw. His footwork was stiff. But his power was undeniable. When he connected, opponents froze. Some didn't get back up. Others never looked the same afterward. Word spread quickly. This wasn't a refined fighter. This was a force. In 1968, everything accelerated. Foreman qualified for the Olympic Games in Mexico City. He was 19 years old. Still emotionally immature. Still fueled by anger more than strategy. But the Olympics didn't reward subtlety. They rewarded dominance. Foreman bulldozed his way through the heavyweight division and won the gold medal. On the podium, he waved a small American flag. It was supposed to symbolize pride. For him, it symbolized arrival. Proof that he mattered. That medal changed how the world looked at him. More importantly, it changed how he looked at himself. He turned professional soon after, stepping into a sport that was brutal even by the standards of the time. Heavyweight boxing in the early 1970s was unforgiving. Careers were short. Damage was permanent. And mistakes were punished immediately. Foreman didn't ease into it. He tore through opponents with the same violence that had once ruled his teenage years. Wins piled up. Knockouts came fast. Promoters loved him. The public feared him. He didn't talk much. He didn't smile. His presence alone felt threatening. That image became part of the marketing. The silent destroyer. The man no one wanted to face. But behind the scenes, the foundation was fragile. Foreman was winning, but he wasn't learning how to lose. He was learning that power solved everything. Coaches warned him about patience, about pacing, about conserving energy. He listened just enough to keep winning. Not enough to change. Money arrived quickly. Attention followed. And with it came isolation. Foreman didn't trust people easily. Success didn't soften him. It reinforced the belief that dominance was the only language that worked. The ring became a place where all his unresolved emotions were allowed to exist without consequences. Outside of it, those emotions had nowhere to go. By the early 1970s, he was undefeated and moving rapidly toward a title shot. Each fight reinforced the myth building around him. Journalists wrote about his power as if it were unnatural. Opponents entered the ring already defeated in their minds. Foreman didn't feel fear. He felt inevitability. But inevitability is dangerous. It creates blind spots. It convinces you that preparation matters less than identity. That you are who you are, and that will always be enough. No one around him was forcing him to confront his weaknesses. No one was asking what would happen if power wasn't enough. Foreman's early career wasn't just a rise. It was a narrowing. Every win pushed him further into a single version of himself. The unstoppable puncher. The intimidating champion in waiting. And the higher he climbed on that image, the harder it would become to survive the moment it cracked. Because in boxing, eventually, it always does. By 1973, George Foreman was no longer a prospect. He was a threat. Undefeated. Feared. And moving straight toward the center of the heavyweight division. Promoters didn't sell his fights on personality or charm. They sold inevitability. The idea that once Foreman touched you, the night would end. The title shot came against Joe Frazier, the reigning heavyweight champion. Frazier was respected. Tested. Proven. He had beaten Muhammad Ali. He was supposed to be durable. On paper, this was a real fight. In reality, it was a dismantling. Foreman knocked Frazier down 6 times in 2 rounds. 6. The referee stopped it not because Frazier quit, but because the damage was becoming irreversible. Cameras caught something rare in heavyweight boxing. Fear. Not from the challenger. From the champion. That night changed everything. George Foreman became world champion, and the narrative locked in. He wasn't just the best heavyweight in the world. He was the most dangerous. Commentators spoke about his punches like natural disasters. Trainers warned fighters to avoid him. Promoters struggled to find opponents willing to sign. With the belt came money. With money came isolation. Foreman didn't celebrate like other champions. He didn't blend into celebrity culture. He stayed guarded. Suspicious. Success amplified his existing traits instead of correcting them. He trusted fewer people. He listened less. And he leaned harder into the identity that had carried him this far, dominance. Training camps became shorter. Sparring partners became more expendable. He relied on intimidation as much as preparation. When you believe no one can stop you, the discipline that got you there starts to feel optional. Wins reinforced that belief. Each defense convinced him that his power would always be enough. The media played its role. Foreman was portrayed as a monster. Silent. Emotionless. A man built only to destroy. That image sold tickets. It also stripped him of nuance. No one asked what was happening inside his head. No one cared. Champions aren't supposed to struggle. They're supposed to win. Behind closed doors, Foreman was uncomfortable in his own success. He didn't know how to enjoy it. Joy felt unsafe. Vulnerability felt like weakness. He stayed tense even in victory. Always ready to fight. Always on guard. The belt didn't bring peace. It brought pressure. As the champion, he was pushed toward one inevitable confrontation. Muhammad Ali. Ali was everything Foreman wasn't. Talkative. Psychological. Strategic. Where Foreman relied on force, Ali relied on patience and mind games. The contrast was perfect for the sport. The build-up was relentless. 2 men. 2 philosophies. 1 belt. Foreman entered that fight convinced of his superiority. Younger. Stronger. Hungrier. He had demolished champions before. There was no reason to believe Ali would be different. He didn't adjust his preparation. He didn't plan for the long game. He planned to break Ali early and leave with the belt intact. But the fight didn't follow the script Foreman had written in his head. From the opening rounds, Ali refused to fall. He leaned back into the ropes. Absorbed punches. Let Foreman swing. Let him burn energy. Round by round, something unfamiliar crept in. Fatigue. Confusion. Doubt. Foreman had never been taken deep into a fight before. He had never needed a second plan. As his punches slowed, the crowd shifted. The confidence that had once filled the ring began to drain. Ali waited. Then struck. When Foreman fell, it wasn't just his body hitting the canvas. It was his identity. The unstoppable force had been stopped. The monster had been exposed as human. And for the first time in his career, Foreman didn't know who he was without dominance. The loss didn't just take the belt. It cracked the foundation everything else was built on. The media moved on. The fear disappeared. Opponents stopped hesitating. Foreman tried to continue fighting, but something essential was gone. The certainty. The inevitability. The version of himself he trusted no longer existed. At the peak of his fame, surrounded by money, recognition, and history, George Foreman found himself more lost than he had ever been as a teenager on the streets of Houston. And the fall had only just begun. After the loss, nothing collapsed all at once. That's what made it worse. George Foreman didn't disappear overnight. He kept fighting. He kept winning some bouts. From the outside, his career looked intact. From the inside, something essential had broken. For the first time in his life, power no longer guaranteed safety. The fear he used to put into others now lived inside him. He trained, but without conviction. He fought, but without certainty. Every punch he threw carried a question he had never faced before. What if this isn't enough anymore? The loss to Ali rewired how people saw him. Fighters stopped backing away. Promoters stopped treating him like an unstoppable force. Journalists stopped using words like inevitable. Subtle shifts, but Foreman noticed all of them. He felt exposed. Stripped of the aura that once protected him. As his confidence eroded, so did his discipline. Training camps lost their intensity. Motivation became inconsistent. The structure that boxing had once given his life started to loosen. Without the belt, without fear, he struggled to find the same reason to endure pain. In 1977, during a fight in Puerto Rico, his body gave out. Foreman collapsed in the locker room afterward, suffering severe heat exhaustion. He later described the moment as feeling close to death. The room faded. His breathing stopped making sense. Panic set in. This wasn't the controlled violence of the ring. This was helplessness. That moment marked a psychological rupture. Foreman experienced what he believed was a near-death experience. Whether physical or emotional, the impact was real. For a man who had built his entire identity on strength and survival, confronting mortality without control was terrifying. Soon after, he retired from boxing. Not with celebration. With confusion. He was 28 years old. An age when most champions are just entering their prime. But he felt empty. Drained. Unsure of who he was supposed to be without the ring. Money didn't save him. In fact, it accelerated the damage. Foreman had earned millions, but he had never learned how to manage it. Lavish spending. Poor investments. Trusting the wrong people. The wealth that once symbolized success turned into a slow leak he didn't notice until it was too late. Years passed. The public moved on. New champions emerged. Foreman faded from relevance. He tried to reinvent himself as a preacher, opening youth centers and community programs. On the surface, it looked like redemption. In reality, it was survival. He needed purpose. He needed structure. He needed something to replace the ring. Behind the scenes, the financial pressure mounted. Donations dried up. Maintenance costs rose. Debts accumulated quietly. Pride kept him from admitting how bad things were. He had been world champion. Admitting failure felt worse than losing any fight. Eventually, the truth surfaced. Foreman was broke. Not struggling. Not tight on cash. Broke. The money was gone. The fame was gone. And the phone stopped ringing. For a man whose entire adult life had been defined by attention and fear, the silence was suffocating. This was the lowest point. Not the knockout. Not the loss. But the realization that strength had an expiration date, and no one prepares you for what comes after. He wasn't fighting opponents anymore. He was fighting irrelevance. And losing. Bankruptcy didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly. Bills unanswered. Properties sold off. Promises postponed. George Foreman kept smiling in public, preaching about faith and second chances, while privately counting what was left. The number kept shrinking. Eventually, it reached zero. He owed money he couldn't repay. The youth center he had poured his identity into was bleeding cash. Donations slowed. Maintenance costs didn't. Every month felt like another small defeat. He had once stood at the top of the world, feared by the strongest men alive. Now he was calling creditors, negotiating time, avoiding conversations he never imagined he would have to have. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the humiliation. Foreman had built his entire sense of worth on being powerful. Being needed. Being undeniable. Now, he felt invisible. Forgotten. Reduced to a former champion whose name meant less with every passing year. He didn't talk about it openly, but the thought haunted him. Had his best years already expired? Was this what remained? The fear wasn't physical anymore. It was existential. He wasn't afraid of getting hurt. He was afraid of being useless. Afraid that everything he had endured, every punch he had taken, had led to nothing permanent. Boxing had given him meaning. Without it, the days felt empty. Directionless. In his late 30s, when most fighters are long retired, a dangerous idea started to form. At first, it sounded ridiculous. Then irresponsible. Then desperate. What if he went back? Not for glory. Not for dominance. But for survival. The people around him tried to stop him. Trainers laughed. Promoters shook their heads. Commentators dismissed the idea immediately. He was old. Slow. Overweight. A relic. Coming back would only damage his legacy further. Why risk becoming a punchline? But Foreman wasn't chasing respect anymore. He was chasing relevance. Stability. A reason to wake up with purpose. The ring was the only place that had ever made sense to him. The only place where effort still had a direct reward. So he returned. Quietly. Without fanfare. Fighting small bouts in small venues. Against opponents no one remembered. The crowds were thin. The coverage minimal. He trained harder than he ever had, not to intimidate, but to endure. He accepted that he would never be young again. He adjusted his style. Fewer punches. Less movement. More patience. Every fight was a risk. Not just to his body, but to his pride. Each round was another chance to confirm what everyone already believed. That he was finished. That time had won. But something unexpected happened. He kept winning. Not impressively. Not violently. But consistently. The joke softened. The skepticism turned cautious. Slowly, the impossible idea stopped sounding impossible. What no one saw was the private battle behind each appearance. The fear of public failure. The pressure of debt. The weight of knowing this was his last option. He wasn't chasing a belt yet. He was chasing dignity. By the time the opportunity finally came, Foreman had already survived the hardest part. The years of being dismissed. The years of being irrelevant. The years where quitting would have been easier, and socially acceptable. The world would remember the punch that followed. But the real victory happened long before that. It happened in silence. In humiliation. In choosing to step back into a place that had once destroyed him, knowing it might do so again. And this time, he stepped in anyway. The turning point didn't arrive with a single phone call or a sudden change in fortune. It arrived slowly, disguised as routine. Training sessions that started before dawn. Long road work done in silence. Repetition without applause. George Foreman rebuilt himself the way men do when there is no audience left. Quietly. Stubbornly. He knew he couldn't fight like he used to. Speed was gone. Reflexes had dulled. What remained was weight, patience, and experience. Instead of trying to chase younger fighters, he learned to let them come to him. He stopped wasting energy. Every movement became economical. Every punch had a purpose. This wasn't evolution by choice. It was adaptation for survival. The media still mocked him. Headlines framed his comeback as nostalgia. A novelty act. A former champion clinging to relevance. Foreman didn't respond. He had learned that words required energy he could no longer afford to waste. The work spoke instead. Fight by fight, he stayed upright. Round by round, he refused to fade. As the wins accumulated, something shifted. Promoters stopped laughing. Commentators stopped dismissing him outright. The tone softened from ridicule to curiosity. Not because he looked impressive, but because he refused to disappear. At an age when most fighters couldn't climb the ring steps, he was still absorbing punishment and giving it back. Inside, the battle was different. Foreman wasn't driven by ego anymore. He was driven by necessity. He needed to keep the lights on. He needed to repay debts. He needed to prove, at least to himself, that he wasn't finished. Every training camp felt heavier than the last. Recovery took longer. Pain lingered. But quitting carried a deeper cost. The real shift came when he stopped fighting time and started working with it. He accepted being slower. He accepted being underestimated. He used that underestimation as cover. Opponents relaxed. They took chances. They stayed in range longer than they should have. And Foreman waited. Years passed like this. Unremarkable fights. Modest paydays. Gradual progress. No shortcuts. No viral moments. Just accumulation. The kind that doesn't look like momentum until it's too late to stop. Then the opportunity surfaced. A title shot against Michael Moorer. Young. Undefeated. A southpaw with speed and confidence. On paper, it made no sense. Foreman was 45. Moorer was in his prime. The fight was approved more out of obligation than belief. Foreman was there to validate the champion. To lose with dignity. Training for that fight was different. Foreman didn't chase conditioning he couldn't reach. He focused on timing. Distance. One opening. He didn't need to win rounds. He needed one moment. Just one. On fight night, he walked to the ring without ceremony. No bravado. No intimidation. Just acceptance. He knew what the world expected. He also knew what he needed. As the rounds passed and the scorecards slipped away, nothing changed in his expression. He had been here before. Losing quietly. Being dismissed. And then the opening appeared. Brief. Almost invisible. Moorer lingered half a second too long. Foreman stepped in and delivered the punch he had been saving for years. Not fueled by rage. Not by ego. But by patience. When Moorer fell, Foreman didn't celebrate immediately. He stood there, stunned. As if he needed proof that what just happened was real. The belt was placed around his waist. Cameras flashed. History was rewritten. But the true turning point wasn't the belt. It was the understanding that came with it. Foreman had won not by returning to who he was, but by becoming someone else entirely. Slower. Older. More deliberate. More human. He didn't beat time. He outlasted it. After the belt was secured, the noise returned. Interviews. Headlines. Praise that had been absent for years. George Foreman smiled more now, but the smile was different. Lighter. Less defensive. He no longer carried the tension of someone afraid to lose what he had just gained. He had already lost everything once. That fear no longer controlled him. He didn't chase another long reign. He didn't try to prove dominance. The mission had been completed. The debt was paid. Financial stability returned. More importantly, dignity returned. For the first time since his early 20s, Foreman felt aligned with himself. Outside the ring, his life expanded in unexpected ways. He embraced entrepreneurship, not as a symbol of excess, but as a tool for independence. The success that followed wasn't built on intimidation or spectacle. It was built on trust. Consistency. A public image reshaped by humility rather than fear. People noticed the change. The same man once described as terrifying was now approachable. Warm. Almost gentle. It confused those who remembered his early career. But for Foreman, this was the version that finally made sense. He no longer needed to scare people to feel valuable. His story began to resonate far beyond boxing. Older athletes saw possibility where they once saw deadlines. Men facing career endings saw a path forward that didn't involve disappearance. Failure, in his case, wasn't a verdict. It was a phase. Foreman spoke openly about fear. About losing identity. About the danger of tying self-worth to a single role. He didn't romanticize his pain. He didn't sell suffering as virtue. He framed it as reality. Something to be survived, not celebrated. The legacy he left behind wasn't defined by titles alone. It was defined by timing. By patience. By the refusal to accept that relevance has an expiration date imposed by others. He showed that adaptation is not weakness. It is intelligence. Younger fighters still study his power. Older viewers study his restraint. His career now reads like two separate lives connected by one choice. The choice to return, not as a younger man pretending nothing had changed, but as an older one who accepted exactly what had. History remembers the punch. The record books remember the age. But those are details. The deeper impact lives in the quiet permission his story gives. Permission to try again when the world has already moved on. Fan 9, KET, Thong Deep. George Foreman's journey isn't about boxing. It's about what happens when the thing that defined you disappears. When the applause stops. When the fear you once inspired no longer protects you from doubt. He lost his title. He lost his money. He lost his identity. And instead of chasing the past, he rebuilt himself around what remained. Discipline. Patience. Willingness to endure embarrassment in silence. The lesson isn't that anyone can become a champion at 45. The lesson is simpler. Your value doesn't end when your prime does. It ends only when you decide your story is finished. Foreman didn't win because he was stronger than time. He won because he stayed present long enough to be ready when the moment finally arrived. Most people quit years before that moment shows up. So if you're standing in a season where nothing seems to be moving, where your best years feel behind you, remember this. Sometimes survival is the strategy. Sometimes patience is the power. And sometimes, the punch that changes everything comes much later than anyone expects. So what's your story?